Hello and welcome to an Infinity the Game major event list analysis video. Today we'll be talking about the lists that made it to the top tables of each of two different recent major Infinity events. CanCon Infinity in Canberra, Australia, and Colder Than Carbonite in Edmonton in Canada. Now, each of these was, to my knowledge, a major satellite event. Both of them would have been something like 50 players. And they really represent our first big chance to look at how major in-person events are shaping up in Infinity N5. We'll be looking at the lists that made it to the top tables for each of these two events, and we'll be looking at them in slightly different ways for each event. For Colder Than Carbonite, which we'll do first, we'll be looking just at the lists that played in the final round. We'll have a deep dive into each of those lists. We'll talk about how the game played out as it was relayed to me. Obviously, I wasn't present, and use the list as examples to talk about really the philosophy of play for each of these specific lists and how you can really build a list that does something very particular very well. We'll then in CanCon pivot to the list's pairings that each of the two players used, because the two players that made it to the top table in Canberra are both very pairing oriented and analytical players. So we'll be looking at how they broke their lists down by scenario and how they each wrote two lists that complemented each other over the course of those 5 rounds. Now, you'll note that I've said the players that made it to the top tables for each event. That means we won't necessarily be looking at full podium breakdowns, for example. This will just be covering those 4 players, and in this case, 6 of the lists that the 4 players used across the two events. I'm sure that if you go to Facebook, you can find the pages for each of these two tournaments. Colder Than Carbonite has its own Facebook page, and Infinity Australia is where you can find information about CanCon Infinity. More information for each event is broken down there. Now, finally, as usual, this video comes with the caveat that I'm doing second-hand list analysis here. I am not the player that played these lists, and I did not, in fact, attend either event. I mean, I was present at CanCon, but I wasn't playing anything this year. That means that this is ultimately going to be a second-hand analysis. I'm going to be making my own assumptions, I'm going to be giving my own thoughts, but ultimately, anything that I can think of will be less personal and less accurate than the players themselves that wrote these lists. So there will probably be things that I miss and nuances that I fail to understand. In certain cases, I'll actually be talking about where you might find further information about each of the different lists, because I think at least in a couple of places, there may well be content that is available elsewhere on the internet that will give you a more first-hand appraisal of each of the lists that are covered. So, with that caveat given, with the note that ultimately this is just my best guess as to how and why these played and my thoughts about them, let's start by jumping into the pairing that played on the top tables of Colder Than Carbonite at Edmonton. So on screen now, we have the lists that were played at Colder Than Carbonite. This was the pairing that fought at the top table in the final round. I don't have the lists that were paired with each of these. So for example, I don't know what the second Steel Phalanx and second Hassassin Baram list were, just that these were the lists that played, and it's kind of a classic matchup. For interest, the scenarios that were played at Colder Than Carbonite were Mind Wipe, Supremacy, Frontline, Unmasking, and Supplies, which means there was overall a hacking emphasis with Mind Wipe, Supremacy, and Unmasking all having hacking bonuses, only Supplies in the final round having another kind of specialist bonus, a Doctor bonus, and 2 scenarios, Supremacy and Frontline, which have a ground control emphasis. Now, while I don't have the second lists for each of the 2 players here, what I can kind of intuit from the lists that are on screen now is that both of these players chose not to focus on the available specialist options and instead basically went with hacking emphasis on the grounds that there would be a lot of hackers, so you'll want to play the hacking game, or alternatively, just coming to the conclusion that hackers overall would be the most effective kind of specialist for the mission mix, which is a fairly good assessment. If you wanted to, you could try and fit a doctor into a list, but you would be doing so just for supplies if you were playing that as specialist emphasis, which means that if you have a doctor, you'll want it to be practical for your lists in a general purpose. Instead, what we can see here are hackers as the main specialists and engineers. Now, to jump into the Steel Phalanx list first, this is what I would describe as kind of a muscular Steel Phalanx list. And that's primarily because it has not just some of the heaviest hitters, but some of the physically largest and most durable models that are available to the faction. And that's because we begin with Agamemnon, or Tagamemnon if you like, the tag available to Steel Phalanx, and he is duoed with a Dactyl Engineer. Now, Agamemnon is a remote presence tag, which means that having an engineer follow him around, just whenever he spends an order, the engineer will spend an order to follow, or will use that order to follow along. This gives you kind of just an efficient package where there is no need for Agamemnon to poop out his Karkata ancillary remote unit in order to get a specialist on the field. You just have the Dactyl, and the Dactyl will be present and nearby to repair Agamemnon basically anytime he should take damage, and he'll be able to do that fairly reliably because although Whip 13 is kind of just average for an engineer, the rerolls from remote presence make it very easy to just make sure that you can always keep Agamemnon in tip-top shape. Now, this is going to contrast interestingly with some tag duos that we will see for our second event when we look at CanCon and differences to approach, but this I would call basically very, very sound. The Dactyl is not aggressively costed. It's only 19 points, and while Agamemnon frankly is pretty expensive, it's a ballistic skill 14 AP heavy machine gun on a robust but not too physically large chassis. This is just solid. Agamemnon, in my experience, has got kind of just enough close combat stats to be difficult to attack in close combat without ever really wanting to get into CC with him yourself. And so the 65-point price tag for him is a little bit difficult to bear, but as part of the overall premise of this list, which is to have many chunky boys that you can recover, it's quite a sound option. There's also kind of the note that with Steel Phalanx, your longer range options are actually they definitely exist in N5. But if you think you're going to want more than, say, 2 big guns, you really do have to start reaching for a piece like Agamemnon, because your other pieces will be spoken for relatively quickly. And in fact, we can see Phoenix and Atalanta in this list, meaning that what Agamemnon represents is like a third big long-range weapon. And for certain terrain setups, tables, environments, that's just something that can be very, very valuable. So next up we have 2 net rods. Yep, excellent. Net rods are just cheap orders who are Warhorse, fantastic. Then we have a 4-person core. Now, this core continues the theme of extreme muscularity, with Ajax FTO as the big and powerful piece, comprising sort of the first model of the core. Ajax is as good as he has ever been. Technically, you could say in N5 he received a nerf in that he has limited cover baked in now, and that's not something that a fire team suppresses, but the overall package is just so incredibly solid. He's hugely dangerous, he's hugely durable, he fires a ton of shots, he's incredibly dangerous in melee, he's quite dangerous at range, and he's not too expensive. This is a piece that you can just anchor a line around if you need to, and it's very, very possible to have entire turns where your opponent is like, well, I need to deal with Ajax, and they just can't because of the combination of his durability and his damage, etc., over the course of an entire turn. The only significant weakness that Ajax really has is that at whip 12 he is susceptible to mobility kills from hacking. You can Carbonite and Oblivion him to turn him off completely, but this list has an engineer. So although we do not have a doctor in the list, we do have a means of recovering our 2 most significantly durable pieces from the things that threaten them the most. We can recover Ajax from states that are inflicted on him. Yes, you could use a speedball for that, but we can also use a speedball for other things in this case. And then for Agamemnon, we can both repair and recover him with the Dactyl Engineer as needed. The link then continues rather with Themiris. Now, Steel Phalanx hacking has basically stayed about the same from N4 to N5. They've lost Pandora but regained Themiris, and Themiris is really just an excellent sort of kind of equivalent to Pandora. He's got a linked pitcher and a bunch of other stuff that is good, including a Cybermine mine layer. Cybermines are quite solid in N5. And so he's overall just a very good specialist to add into a list, particularly given that the broad mix of missions at Colder Than Carbonite was quite hacker forward, with a number of missions needing hackers to get the best specialist bonuses. In supplies, Themiris is going to just be raw dogging that whip 14 of his, but whip 14 is fine. Themiris, it should be noted, also has Trinity, which means that if you are really just looking for a hacker that does everything in a single piece, here's an exceptional splash element into a list. You can go more hacker heavy by including Scylla, but if you want just enough hacking to make a significant impact on a game state but not represent an overinvestment, Themiris is one of the best 21-point options in the game. We then, as the lieutenant, have a Myrmidian officer, and this is an interesting choice, but one that I respect. One of the things I would expect a common choice for Lieutenant in Steel Phalanx, particularly if you were building specifically for supplies, to be Machaon. Machaon is a doctor, and he's high willpower, and he's just his own kind of good piece, but he's in particular a very good doctor, which gives you the ability to recover your no wound incapacitation pieces, right? If they reach that wounded state, they can be recovered, and there are specialist bonuses available in supplies. However, he's considerably more expensive than a Myrmidon officer. And by taking things like Phoenix and Ajax, etc., Agamemnon, oh, I went right over Phoenix. Phoenix is really good. I don't think I need to tell anyone that, but Phoenix, there you go. It's your second of three significant guns in this list. Anyway, the Myrmidon. The Myrmidon is 12, I think 12 points cheaper than Machaon. And that's a lot of points, basically. We've got things like Agamemnon and Ajax in this list. We can see Atlanta in Combat Group 2. That really thins out how many flex points you have to spend elsewhere on little and nice upgrades like Machaon. And since this link already has a Whip 14 specialist, and since there's so much no wound incapacitation, which means that by definition many of your troops are good to the last drop, they're not going to leave a body around for you to recover with a doctor, the Myrmidon officer just represents the cheaper but still very useful option. The second thing that the Myrmidon officer does is that it is one, I think possibly the only source of Eclipse grenades in the faction. Now, this is a very good list at gunfighting. It's a very dangerous list at basically all ranges, and it's a list with plenty of smoke, but Eclipse smoke does things that you just can't otherwise do. It blocks all visibility even to MSVs. And if there is potentially a high quality MSV2 ARO piece on the table, that's an element that you don't necessarily want to fight with a model like Atlanta or Phoenix, because there's a high potential that it will be ignoring the most significant benefit that those two pieces have. So just having the option, right? I suspect ultimately the reason why the Myrmidon officer is here is that it is 12 points cheaper than Machaon, but having the option to have Eclipse is something that just can be really significant in some games. It won't be in the game that will have been played on the top table here because there's no significant MSV in any of the Hassan Baram lists. But if you told me that Brennan, I think was the name of the player who played Steel Phalanx in this case, if you told me that Brennan had run into MSV over the course of his trip to top table at Colder Than Carbonite, and the Eclipse had been meaningful, I would very much believe that. So there is a trade-off here. Yes, Machaon would probably be a nicer piece to have if you had the points, but this list just doesn't have the points. We then have a Probot and just a 13-point Thorakides. If you go through the rest of the list, you will see that there are basically no other cheap cheerleaders that are available. This list is running 2 Lamads and 2 Natrods, which is max AVA for both. So once we've taken the Probot, we're already running lots of strict cheerleaders in this case, and the Thorakides just kind of splits the difference between cheerleader and corner guard and specialist if needed. Fine, 13-point pace. Combat Group 2, we then have a fairly light selection of pieces. We have a Warcore. Now, I believe that Colder Than Carbonite did play with ITS 16.2, but which means that the Warcore will be a specialist, but it didn't play with the special tactical options that you get in each mission. So the Warcore, I think, would be a good choice regardless of whether or not it was a specialist. The fact that it's a specialist makes it an excellent choice, but it's still there's only one irregular in this list. You will otherwise be using your command tokens for things like re-rolling repairs on Agamemnon and counterintelligence and speedball, or shipping orders and speedball, but you will have the command token spare to turn that Warcore's irregular order regular at least once a game, probably. Given the fact that it's a specialist, it's just a highly valuable piece for 3 points, not surprised to see it. We then have a K2 Auxilia FTO. Now, it's not going to be joining any links. And this is one of the sole things that I would potentially consider making the change on. Very small tweak. By the way, K2 Auxilias, the Caryatids, outstanding profiles, like really nice. I believe you can only have one of them in Steel Phalanx. You can link them, but it's difficult to fit them into links kind of easily. You need sort of a fair bit of support around them before they start getting link bonuses, unless you link them with, I think, a Dactyl, and that starts getting a little bit expensive. But one change I would consider making to this list if I was to play it myself is to actually make the Thorakides not a specialist. Now, that is a risk. Having the Thorakides as a forward observer just gives you certain options that you otherwise wouldn't. But given that the Warcore is a specialist, given that you have specialists in the form of Agamemnon, the Dactyl, and the Themiris, I would personally consider downgrading the Thorakides from a forward observer just to a regular 12-point Thorakides, and spending 1 point to upgrade the K2 Auxilia to have a Mind Dispenser. It's only 12 points rather than 11, and you get your choice. It's the same overall weapon. You keep the Breaker Pistol and the Flash Pulse. You do lose the Emerat, so if the K2 is being used just as a corner guard, then you're in slightly worse shape there. So, okay, swings and roundabouts. But I consider Group 2 Mind Dispensers, particularly in lists that have baggage, just to be a super nice luxury. Being able to just spend an order every turn, knowing that you'll automatically reload and throw a couple of, say, paramines out into the midfield. Paramines are potentially hugely disruptive because there's nothing that just kind of comfortably ignores them. Throwing a couple of paramines out into the midfield buys you a ton of space. It can be hugely disruptive to your opponent's plans. It can just generally be really, really high impact for just 1 point over the Emirat. Now, ultimately, the Emirat is a much, much stronger corner guard because electromagnetic weapons are electromagnetic weapons. And if you are concerned, for example, about something like a Norcaius Rampage, I can't really imagine you would be as Steel Phalanx. Norcaius is a little bit scared to get into close combat with some of these pieces. It's not that he can't beat them, but there is some risk associated with him trying to make that kind of run. Then the Emirat is safer as a corner guard. But the upside of the Mind Dispenser over the course of an entire game, I would consider to be just very slightly higher. Overall, these are still both good choices, just a small kind of, hey, for general purpose use, this is a change that I might consider. We then have two Lamed Rebots, yep, they're orders and repeaters, nothing wrong with them, and Atlanta, the surprise attack version of Atlanta. Now, I don't actually particularly have an opinion as to which Atlanta I think is better. The total reaction version is obviously very appealing, but I think the total reaction version is a little bit more solvable for. She's a known quantity when she's on the table. Whereas the surprise attack version obviously has hidden deployment and is more dangerous, at least for the turn that she appears. Very few things are immune to surprise attack these days, particularly you can stack that with smoke shooting through the multispectral visor, and although she's only burst 2, what a burst 2, effectively. But frankly, I suspect the choice here was made at least partially because of the points cost. Surprise Attack Atlanta is 3 points cheaper, and you need every point that you can get in this list because there's really just nothing spare unless you do something like downgrading the Thorakides to a fat robot, a probot, and at that point you're starting to have even things like deployment issues. So overall, this is a list that is doing a few things really, really quite well. It is playing the usual Steel Phalanx game of having a very dangerous offensive and defensive core. That team of Ajax, Phoenix, the Mirrors, and the Myrmidian can either sit static and throw out pitches and hack things and be an ARO piece, or it can go ham and it has the smoke grenades and the Eclipse smoke grenades and the multi-range shooting to really move forward if it wants to. It can make that choice. Agamemnon and the Dactyl kind of have similar luxuries where they can shoot at long range or they can move forward to do objectives, maybe not close assault, but move forward to do objectives. You have multiple orders and a lot of offensive flexibility, and then in Combat Group 2 you have the Warcore as a specialist and Atalanta as a very dangerous gunfighter. But what we're looking at here is a list that is combining both just good durability, like multiple very durable pieces, full 15 trooper allotment, with, by the standards of Steel Phalanx, really high quality gunfighting. This is, in effect, probably the best gunfighting Steel Phalanx list that I think you can write. Anything else you tried to put into the list after this risks really significant diminishing returns. We have put every single high-quality gun that we can put in here, basically. And we've done that without sacrificing the core of what makes Steel Phalanx strong, things like visibility control, real closed-loop powerful defense, making this just overall perhaps kind of a straightforward list, but a straightforward list in a way whose strengths are just really, really evident. I would go as far as to say that you could probably play this list in any scenario, like literally any scenario, and you could play this list and expect to get good results just because it is operating on a fundamental set of strengths that are just so strong. That contrasts really interestingly with the list that it's going to be playing against. So Brennan's Steel Phalanx would play against, on the top table, Owen's Hassassin Baram. And it's here that I should mention that if you are looking for actual first-hand evidence or information about how these lists played, this was, I believe, Owen previously from Gaming with the Cooler, now the Tactical Awareness podcast, and so I really wouldn't be surprised if the Tactical Awareness guys put out an episode on this event, probably sometime relatively soon. I'm pretty sure they were both there, Ash and Owen, and I can't for the life of me remember the third person on Tactical Awareness because I just do not have enough time for podcasts these days to my great and eternal suffering. But Tactical Awareness was absolutely present at Colder Than Carbonite, and, minor spoiler alert, Owen I believe would end up coming first. Now, if you have followed Owen's career and Infinity over time, in my case I would say have been influenced by, because Owen was one of the kind of formative content creators that I was watching as I learned the game. So was Ash, Guerrilla Miniatures Gaming. This is a concept that has endured at least since the previous edition. Owen has been cooking on ideas around this for a while, and I believe this is not his first tournament where he has taken a Hassassin Baram list that we can best describe as extremely asymmetric. But it's doing asymmetric in a way that is kind of interesting and very slightly different to, I think, some of the lists that emerged in early N5, he says, as if we aren't still in early N5. Hassassin Baram are a faction that can be played a few different ways, and they're a faction that I'm currently exploring myself a little bit. I'd like to do a battle report on them kind of soon. But one of the first list archetypes that emerged for Hassassin Baram, like almost as soon as N5 drops, with people just looking at the profiles that got glow ups, putting them in a list and seeing what we get, was an extreme hidden deployment, defensive, specialist oriented, just ambush your opponent, ablate them away with your like deployable defenses and your ambush tactics, and then do the mission at the end of the game style list, built around Hassassin ARs, which we can see in this list, and Hassassin Shujay, which notably we can't. Now, the Shujay, no, just speaking about it now, given its absence, is a piece that really got a glow up in N5. It is a mine layer 2, meaning it can deploy 2 mines. It has electromagnetic mines, and it's a reasonably high quality specialist and gunfighter. It's got a Flamen Spear, which means it can be used as an ambush piece, and it has hidden deployment, which means it can be used as a late game run forward and push a button. It has, I believe, forward deployment +8, which puts it in range to single move onto any midfield objective in a single order and, like, say, press a button on the last turn of the game in a scenario like Acquisition. Now, those can be paired with Hassassin ARs, which also have hidden deployment and are also specialists, but are much stronger kind of ambush predators in active turn, as well as being able to react with pieces like emitters to either significantly double down on your reactive, appear from hidden deployment, ambush attack, catch your opponent when they weren't prepared for it, Flamen Spear links with the Shujays, hit tags with the emitters, stuff like that. Or you can use the Hassassinars a little bit more easily in active turn, where they have a really high surprise attack -6 modifier, which, unlike the Shujay, they can potentially make use of over multiple turns thanks to Hollow Projector. You can have a situation where the Hassassin emerges, maybe makes a triangulated fire attack straight out of hidden deployment, makes that attack, suppresses its target, pulls back, and then Hollow Projector reestablishes itself for free in the states phase so that the Hassassin can surprise attack again next turn. Now, there is a small problem with that list as a concept, and that is that it has 4 hidden deployment models, which are 4 orders that will not necessarily be available to you, say, on the first turn if you're going first, which really, really pigeonholes you into a specific playstyle. To run that list effectively, you either need to know how to play with an order deficit potentially from the first turn, or you have to give up some of your hidden deployment and your ambush ability if you need to press, like if you need to press an advantage, or you need to just do things like hard go second, rely on your defenses, and play for late game scenarios if indeed late game scenario is what you're playing. Owen's list, while potentially a tiny little bit of a meme in some respects, it is a double AR, double Sundukbut list, solves this by exchanging the Shujay for Sundukbuts, because a Sundukbut has decoy and puts out multiple camouflage markers and is very dangerous in ARO, provided you get the range bands, particularly for the rifle profiles right. But it is generating its regular order the entire game, regardless of what else is happening, and it does not leave you in that order deficit situation, particularly if, say, in Combat Group 2, the Hassassin AR might be revealing itself and moving forward, and therefore spending those orders, getting itself on the table, making sure you aren't playing from an order deficit. And so that gives us a list that is still extremely defensively oriented. It's extremely asymmetric. We'll go through all the pieces in a moment, but it kind of splits the difference just a little bit relative to what I would call like the meta first order, immediately discovered full asymmetric hidden deployment Hassassin list in an interesting and kind of pleasing way. So what is the list overall? Well, we have an 8-6 split. So we're playing 14 troops rather than 15. In the first combat group, we have a Matalia with Jammer, just 6 points. Jammer, there is baggage in this list, so the Matalia will potentially be able to reload. And then I believe, sort of ignore that Camille that's in the middle of those linked models, I believe this is a 4 or 5 person potentially link. It's all just one kind of support link built around Ghulam. We have a +1 command token Ghulam Lieutenant, 2 Barid Killer Hackers, a Ghulam NCO Rifle Grenade Launcher, Smoke Grenade Launcher, and then Layla Sharif as yet another hacker. She is a KHD with Carbonite and a Firewall. The Firewall only potentially likely to be used in this case, but having Carbonite is the main thing, where it gives you 3 killer hackers, but still an ARO that you can take otherwise. And so that's a link that has, at any given time, probably 2 Ghulam and 2 Barids. And Layla herself counts as a Ghulam, which means that you're getting 3-person bonuses, but more importantly, you're getting 2-person bonuses really, really reliably. Even if you shed out a bunch of models, if you lose some hacking jewels and the Barids or Layla start dying, you will keep the burst bonuses on that link, which is the special die bonuses, which is very relevant because what that link is primarily doing, I mean, it can may be forced to move forward and try and accomplish mission objectives. In fact, we know that it would on at least one occasion in this final game. But the main thing that it stands out to me as being really good for, and reflective of how I have been playing certain links in Assassin Baram, is that it's just an outstanding support link. From the safety almost of its deployment zone, it can throw out smoke with the Ghulam NCO, it can throw out spec fire if it needs to, it can throw out pitches with the Bereed KHDs, and then the Bereed KHDs are very, very good at winning hacking duels. Yes, they're not quite Interventor KHDs, but for 14 points and with a linked pitcher, they are one of the best value hackers in the game, and they're very good at establishing hacking dominance against anything short of the most powerful hackers in the game otherwise. And so you can have this link, like in this case, it's a relatively large link, but you can have this even in a smaller configuration, and you can have it just be really impactful on the game, kind of just from the safety of your deployment zone from behind all of these defenses. And that's a really important part of how a list like this might choose to function, because stuff like the double Sundukbuds, you really need to be in a situation where your opponent feels that they need to cross the table and come to you for those Sundukbuds to be at their best. You need to force your opponent to engage into and break upon the ambush potential of your defenses, which means that you need reach, but in particular you need reach that is decoupled from actually sacrificing models. Yes, there's a Assassin for Day, it's going to be doing Assassin for Day things, but once the for Day is spent or discovered or destroyed or just hangs out somewhere, whatever, being able to throw out pitches, secure kills, be annoying, doesn't risk any of your troops and does force your opponent to come to you, at which point the jammers and the ARs, if they're used defensively, and the Sundukbuts, etc., all really come into their own. Now, there aren't enough troops to do it in this particular list, but if you had, for example, one extra Ghulam, you could quite easily turn this into a pair of 3-person teams, a 3-person Haris and a 3-person core, and you can even get bonuses in that case by doing things like having one Ghulam and 2 Bereed KHDs. That's got 2 Bereeds in it, so it gets fireteam bonuses of having 2 troopers. Something like the Ghulam Lieutenant and 2 Bereeds, or Ghulam NCO and 2 Bereeds, is a very, very able support team that operates kind of like on a smaller footprint. But I like, for example, Lila Sharif here. She can potentially do a little bit of gunfighting, but the main thing she is she's a utility hacker that adds another KHD, but more importantly, that Carbonite. We then have the first of 2 Assassin ARs. This is a Ballistic Seal Attack +1 Burst AP Rifle Emitter Viral Pistol AR. Now, I'll make a bit of an admittance here. When I first looked at the AR profiles, when they were spoiled, like in the lead up to N5, my assumption was that the Thunderbolt profile would probably be the one that saw the most use. But actually, in practice, that was before we saw how Triangulated Fire had changed. Triangulated Fire now attracts no penalties whatsoever. You just roll on your ballistic skill, which makes things like the +1 Burst AP Rifle actually a really appealing profile because it's burst 4 rather than burst 3 on something like the Thunderbolt. I'd had assumed that the Thunderbolt would be more relevant, but no. Emitters have got really, really nice range bands now and are a fantastic ambush weapon if if you want to hit something like a tag with that, either just in ARO because it didn't expect the attack, or surprise attack -6. Yes, I think an emitter is only burst 2, but burst 2 when you're stacking a -6 can still land a hit, and a piece like an emitter only really needs to land 1 hit. You also have the interesting choice within certain range bands of being able to decide whether to triangulated fire with your AP rifles or your viral pistols. If the viral pistols are live as a weapon, you're fighting a target with wounds, they're probably more dangerous. The AR is obviously also a specialist operative, which means that in a pinch it can do things like move forward. 6-2 movement is quite nice in N5. It can move forward, it can do objectives, it can do things in the mission, and it's probably more likely to want to do that much of the time than trying to move forward an entire, say, 4 or 5-person link to accomplish the same objectives. So, hey, Assassin AR, very much rescued from the trash heap of N4 into N5, and we see 2 of them in this list. We have a second Assassin AR. This is a forward deployment one. Importantly, this one has disco balls. Now, Assassin Baram kind of generally have always had access to ample smoke grenades, but have never had access to any kind of eclipse until N5. There are, I think, 2 pieces with disco balls. The Assassin AR, and then, of course, the Asawira regiment, both of which potentially add a really significant amount of value to Assassin Baram because, and we can see it very much in this list, the long-ranged elements, in stark contrast to Brennan's Steel Phalanx list, triangulated fire on the ARs, and that's kind of about it. It is not impossible to make Hassassin Baram lists that can have kind of a semblance of range dominance, but it's not necessarily where the faction's strengths lie. And now in N5, being able to close that loop and actually just be like, no, I can walk past an MSV ARO piece if I need to, with things like the AR Disco Baller, I think is kind of quite relevant. Forward deployment also if you're intending to use it as a specialist piece, and there are not necessarily that many other pieces in this combat group that might choose to have orders spent on them actively. Forward deployment is just a small luxury there, although forward deployment 4 is usually, it is by definition, the lowest impact of the forward deployments, and you're not always guaranteed to get a good place to hide with a piece like that. Still, it's got a Panzerfaust, which makes it a dangerous ARO element. It's got a breaker rifle which it can triangulated fire with, and it's a forward deploying, hidden deployment 6-2 specialist with hollow projector. We then have a Furnus remote and 2 Neurokinetics viral rifle Sunduk Butts with +1 burst. So that is a burst 2 chain rifle or burst 4 viral rifle in ARO. Now, I will note that my own prior experience experimenting with the Neurokinetics Sunduk Butts is that I really found I needed the AP Spitfire. I, using them just occasionally, never built the experience up with them to find reliably those positions where the somewhat awkward 8 to 16 only range band on the viral rifle could reliably be employed as an ARO piece. That meant that myself, as a person that would put, say, the one Virgin Sunduk versus the 2 Chad Sunduk list, I could just more reliably guarantee that I would always be able to find a good applicable spot for my singular Sunduk AP Spitfire if I took the Neurosynetics version. But there is a cost to that. Specifically, it's about 5 points. It's 5 points more and 1.5 SWC. Now, this list ably has the SWC spare, but 5 points is not necessarily easy to find, and so we have the cheaper version of the Sunduk. And in fact, at 45 points, the Neurokinetics viral rifle is just the cheapest Sunduk that you can buy. I don't have the experience to comment on this, but I might make the guess that by having 2 of these, you can maybe a little more reliably find those positions where, because there's 2 of them, you don't have the same obligation that you do to really maximize the use of just one. And so you can find the positions where the rifle range bands are a little bit more reliable. I would also note that since this list is only running 14 troopers, the presence of those Sunduk could kind of easily be confused for some Dalami. Now, I think most experienced players will look at the points that are visible in this list and go, something weird is happening, and I can already tell that there are no Shujay because there are no regular Mimetism 3 camouflage markers, so there's some weird crap going on. Where is all of your stuff and what is happening? And particularly once the AR begin to reveal, I feel like it would become quite evident that yes, those camouflage markers are concealing Sunduk but there is still fairly able fog of war, and we are early enough into N5 as an addition that it's very possible that people won't be able to, not just yet, really reliably make those calls as to what might be under those camouflage markers. We then have the singular sole 23-point Hassassin Fidei. I do not at all mind running Hassassin Barams with just a single Fidei. Hassassin Fideis always work best when they are a reserve drop. You only get one reserve drop if you're going second, and it can be quite an impost to spend a command token for the second reserve drop when you're going first. And in any case, 2 Fidei, spend the command tokens, go first, is a chain of events that's only going to arise some of the time. The second Fidei is by no means bad, but it is very gently diminishing returns relative to the first. We then have a second Mutawiya, Chain Rifle, and Jammer, meaning there are 2 Jammers in this list. Now, by running the cheaper Jammer Mutawiya, we are in a situation where there is perhaps a little bit less smoke than you might otherwise like in the list. There is just the smoke grenade launcher on the Ghulam and the Disco Baller on the AR, and I guess technically the smoke grenades on the Fidei, but there's really no way to find extra points in this list. You could feasibly turn Layla Sharif into a Ghulam hacker and say, well, 2 Bareed KHDs is enough, I will take a generic hacker as my last hacker, but then you don't have anything that can fight at everything in the list at that point is just a grenade launcher or rifle range bands, whereas Layla Sharif offers at least some potential gunfighting. I think you could also feasibly downgrade the Ghulam +1 command token lieutenant. That man is super clearly has a target on his head, but on the other hand, there's literally no other models in the list that can be the lieutenant anyway. But depending on your experience with the list, you might find that if you cut the Golem Lieutenant down from the +1 command token to just the baseline version, use those points to upgrade Matawiya, you might find yourself more easily spending the Matawiya's irregular orders because they have more things that they can do with those irregular orders, so you would need the command tokens less anyway and kind of get a little bit more value overall. That's just a personal appraisal though, and obviously both players made it to the top table and therefore very much understood what their game plans were and performed well over the course of the entire event. Now, what it does give us is a very interesting clash of philosophies in the two lists. We have a strong and muscular and robust and long range and dangerous Steel Phalanx list, and then we have a primarily asymmetric defensive hacking poke, hidden deployment, total reaction, jammers, smoke, style Hassassin Baram list. And this is a matchup that I would expect to go kind of very differently depending on the scenario. Overall, I would probably say Steel Phalanx is very lightly favored, and it's very lightly favored mostly because, particularly that Phalanx core, can just potentially move up the field and not necessarily worry too much about tripping Hassassin Baram defenses. One of the thing about that Steel Phalanx list is that it's just so tough. There's so much mimetism, high wounds, etc., that with a little bit of caution, you can move it forward aggressively and dangerously, and then something reveals and you're like, that's fine, I've got Mimetism 6 and I'll shoot you back. However, the game is not played in a vacuum. The game is played on a scenario, and in this case, the scenario was supplies. There's also one final thing that's kind of interesting and relevant here. Now, I don't know if Owen knew this going into the mission or not, but by all accounts, the tournament points heading into the final mission were sufficient that Owen could play to a draw and still potentially win the event overall. Now, again, I'm emphasize that I'm kind of just repeating things that have been relayed back to me by the people who sent me through these lists. I didn't receive these lists from the players directly. I hope they don't mind me talking about their lists. But that offers certain potentials, particularly for doing things like running a defensive list. A defensive list in a scenario like supplies is much easier to play if you can play to just stall the game out and find your out and just get that over the line, draw the scenario kind of play in the final turn. And by all accounts, that's apparently more or less what happened. Relayed to me secondhand by Travis from Owen is that Owen's perspective was that Brennan played exceptionally throughout the entire game. He said that Owen was rolling very well and playing very well and just doing a really good job with a really good list, and that Owen was on the back foot for almost the entire game. However, I would note that good players and great players are differentiated by their ability to see their outs in any given situation, and my rough understanding is that Owen went into the final turn playing from second, slightly behind. There was one unclaimed supply box that was being heavily overwatched by Steel Phalanx elements, Agamemnon and Atlanta and Phoenix, I think, or at least three pieces including Atlanta and Agamemnon. And that the game state and score was such that getting to that previously unclaimed supply box would not win Owen the game, but it would tie the game for him. Now, under normal circumstances, that level of Overwatch would be borderline impossible for Phalanx to deal with because of the presence of Atlanta. Now, you might think I'm about to say, yes, well, this is where the AR with Disco Baller comes up, but it does not, apparently. There is another way that this list has to potentially get into combat with an objective without being seen by Atlanta. And that's because pitchers are silhouette 1 in this edition, and they have a silhouette, which means that they block line of fire. And so, although the line was pretty obscure, the play was, which drew Owen the game, which won Owen the event, my understanding is, was to lay down some smoke to stop Agamemnon and whatever else was watching the objective, and then fire two pitches, because you do need two next to each other to block line of sight suitably, fire two pitches that would then enable a Barid to make a cautious move, get into contact with the box without being seen by Atlanta because it's literally hiding behind a pair of silhouette 1 pieces of deployable equipment, and then open the box to secure the draw, which is a hell of a line of play. Is it a little janky? Yeah, it kind of is. But the thing is it's an out, right? It's an out that you find to secure the game, and a worse player probably wouldn't have seen that. So congratulations to both of these players. This was ultimately a top table that resulted in a draw, but that draw meant that Owen's performance over the rest of the event meant that I believe he took first place overall. If not, that's how it was relayed to me, and it makes a good story. But regardless, very, very well done to both of these players. And what an interesting contrast they present to us between really well built, multiple ranges, very dangerous, very durable steel phalanx, and highly specialized asymmetric assassin Baram that is nevertheless doing just a couple of things kind of interestingly to play away from the limitations of otherwise a very hidden deployment focused faction, and if I'm being honest, perhaps just use a couple of pieces that the player really, really likes. Overall, it sounded like a great event and a great game, and well done to both players for making it to the top table. Now, up next, I'm going to take a small break, have a drink, but then we're going to jump into Infinity CanCon, and we're going to look at the philosophy behind a pair of list pairings for each of two players that made it to the top table. Kestrel Colonial Force, piloted by Hector, and Toha, piloted by Ed. And so on screen now are Hector's Kestrel list. Now, for those people who don't know the Australian community, Hector is an extremely long-running and extremely skilled player. Till now, he's been a little bit of an always a bridesmaid kind of player, but you could pretty much guarantee that if you wanted to make it to the top tables of an event, you would have to play Hector at some point along the way if you didn't play him in the finals. That level of consistent and strong caliber of player. Now, we're going to be a little bit quicker breaking down each of the lists for each of the players in this case because there are twice as many of them. But something to start with in terms of the discussion is that each player here has done something that I don't but probably should and broken their lists down by mission. Now, this is an extremely common thing to do in Infinity, and I am just something of a contrarian. I have generally found that my preference is to focus on beating my opponent by beating my opponent, and if I just do that, I can play the mission ably and win. But it is probably a more sensible way to approach the game to beat your opponent by playing the mission better than they do. That is, after all, how you win Infinity. And so, for both Hector and Ed, we can see slightly different list to mission breakdowns, with each list therefore specialized to play 2 or 3 different missions in different ways. And the primary differentiation that we will see in Hector's lists is that his secondary list is built for unmasking and decapitation. His first list is built for acquisition, supplies, and firefight. Unmasking and decapitation are scenarios where you need to move out and destroy civilians, HVTs. And so you need the ability to aggressively potentially project force quite far across the table and then pull back to safety, whereas acquisition, supplies, and firefight can all potentially be played somewhat more conventionally. And in Hector's own words, this first list, the acquisition, supplies, and firefight list, is very much an N4 list, but I think that actually makes it really interesting. Because one of the things that we're going to see here is probably the first actual pure 5-person link that I have seen in N5, and it makes very good use of that. So the list begins with a purely offensive duo, which we will see mirrored and amplified in the second list, which is an innovation possibly of Hector. Certainly it's the first time I have seen it, but which I think I really, really like. And it's a Hetkari Firefly team. Now we will see this mirrored and amplified in the form of a Tikbalang Firefly team in list 2, but this is a fascinating little duo. It does not get duo bonuses. The Hetkari does not count as a Kestrel model. That's things like Fireflies and Bipandra. Bipandra is in this list, and Bipandra could be shuffled into that team to turn it into a Haris. That would require changing certain other things. But the basic observation seems to be that the Hetkari does not really need the special die bonuses. And so what you get in this team is you get an NCO order from the Firefly, the wonderful, just super high quality, super high use armed turret marksman rifle with mine layer, and then the Hetkari's guns. And so what will happen is that any time, right, any time during the turn that you need to spend an order just to reposition, you will use the Firefly's NCO order, and as part of that, you'll throw out a turret. You'll just do that as part of an order, second short skill, that's fine, the Hetkari will be moving 6 inches. And so this allows the Firefly to help the Hetkari shuffle around, including retreating when needed, and build that turret defense, which is very, very useful and buys you time and buys you space and allows actually both of these lists to play a really strong defensive game if they need to. And because the Firefly is the sole mine layer armed turret in the game, that strength persists even if you are going first. We then have a 5-person pure Fennec team. It has a Griffin and Bipandra in it, but those count as Fennecs, and it's comprised of a Griffin, Feuerback, Bipandra with tactical awareness, 2 triangulated fire Thunderbolt mine layer Fennecs, a Fennec combi rifle, for 5 troops total. Now there's just the one specialist here by Pandra, but she's a good specialist and a doctor, very useful in combination with things like the Griffin. There's a lot of firepower redundancy in this team. But the most important thing that this team does is that it presents like N4 style pure core Link with Sixth Sense AROs. One of the things I've noticed about MSV2 AROs in N5 is that the existence of white noise and the way that white noise works, I mean, it hasn't nominally changed, although albedo is actually good now. But the extremely limited access to Sixth Sense makes solving for things like, say, a Riot Girl missile launcher considerably easier. Not every faction has access to stuff like white noise, right? It is ultimately limited as far as technology goes. But if you do have it, all of a sudden you can actually use it for its intended purpose and really just mess with things like a Riot Girl linked with some moderators. The Griffin is an MSV1 Feuerback ARO, and so really dangerous in terms of ARO. It's firing explosive rounds, it's effectively ballistic skill 15 thanks to link bonuses with +1 special die and an MSV1, and it's a durable heavy infantry. But because this is a 5-person pure Fennec core, it can't be smoke shot, quote unquote, through white noise. It can't be neutralized in that way, and that's basically a really big deal. It's also just a really big gun in active, but important to note this link, thanks to the presence of the Triangulated Fire Mine Layer Thunderbolt Fennecs, can still keep shooting in active turn if the Griffin goes down, firing pseudo burst for Thunderbolt shots. You wouldn't want to use those to dislodge something like a tag, but you have those secondary weapons there, or as ARO pieces later in the game, and of course their mine layers, etc. This is a wonderful N4 style link, and again, that is how Hector described it, and it's really the first time I've seen something like that played in this edition, and it apparently performed very, very well for him, although it wasn't the list that he played in the final round. We then have a Banshee KHD. This is something I think that will also appear in his other list. No, I'm wrong, never mind. But notable about the Banshee KHD is that it doesn't come with anything like an Evo hacker to help it combat jump, because it doesn't really need it. Yes, Hector would try and land it over the course of the event, but if it fails, it's got jet propulsion, 6/6 move effectively. It's just going to get where it needs to go anyway, and so it represents a relatively low investment that just appears and always does something useful. It either lands where it wants to, or it just gets where it wants to anyway because it's so fast. And this is a really good approach to pieces like this, and something that we should probably be using and thinking about more, even if for myself I still am a little bit in that vein of, no, but I really want it to land. No, you really don't need it to. You can have combat. Like, I am already building JSA Shinden Butai lists that intentionally don't use the drop function on their drop troops. The logical next step is to use it if it exists, and if it fails, don't sweat it. Up next, we have a Beast Hunter. There is one Beast Hunter and one Yamabushi in this list. You could easily run, for example, 2 Yamabushis, but the Beast Hunter is more forward deployed and more aggressively mobile. I think I personally prefer the Yamabushis in a vacuum, but I can get very much why you would run 1 and 1, and the Panzerfaust +1 burst heavy flamethrower Panarchianian variant, in particular that +1 burst heavy flamethrower, really does enable certain more dangerous effects. It makes the fork much more dangerous against the CC attack because you really are trying to land that double heavy flamethrower. It's very dangerous. We then have an Infiltration Mine Layer Jackal. This is just one of the best profiles in the game. Dalami wish they were something like this. It doesn't have camouflage, but it lays a shock mine, and it has a boarding shotgun and a boarding pistol for close-in work, and it has an EM grenade launcher. Just a fantastic profile. You can always spend its irregular order if you want to, just spec firing, and I believe over the course of the event it did some work. Combat Group 2, we have a Scarecrow Killer Hacker. Now, this gives us 2 KHDs, which is relevant in acquisition, but in particular, it's also an infiltrating specialist. Infiltrating specialists are kind of old wisdom. Like, I will put them in lists only occasionally because I tend to write lists that are very generalist. I will write a list and then I will choose to play it in whatever scenario my opponent wants to play. And that means that the kind of specialization that you look for when you are building lists specifically for scenarios is not something I actually have that much experience with. I faction butterfly my way through multiple different factions, multiple different scenarios, and I don't specialize terribly much. But it's the old wisdom. Playing something like Supplies and having a Scarecrow appear on potentially the first order and just roll until he picks up the box and then run away with the box is a really classic way of winning a scenario like Supplies. Similarly, Acquisition. You just wait until the very last turn of the game, and then you appear and try and activate a console and control the console, and you get a bunch of points. And so this kind of midfield specialist play, like that's the very elemental description of how these things work, but just more generally, that kind of valuable midfield specialist for not too many points that can do classifieds, etc., is very much Hector's bailiwick. He has been playing for a very long time. I think he's an N2 veteran. He's certainly a native Spanish speaker and probably has played in original Spanish. And so this kind of like, yes, infiltrating, hidden deployment, camouflage specialists are really, really good, and the Scarecrow is a good example of them. It's the kind of thing that fits very well into his lists. We then have a Yamabushi. It's a regular version of the Beast Hunter that's a little bit less mobile and a little bit less forward deploying, but is regular and has Dogged. It's an excellent piece and has actually good close combat. We then have a duo of a Magistrate Lieutenant Strategos 1 with a single Jackal. Now, if you wanted to trim some points down, you could get a second Jackal into this and run it as a Haris, because the Hetkari Firefly team is just a duo. But this list has the points to turn the potential second Jackal into a Mulebot, and the Mulebot just adds far too much to this list to be cut. Particularly because of the Firefly Mine Layer, you just want that access to baggage. The utility of that Firefly goes up and up and up if it's able to place multiple turrets over the course of the game, if not the turn. And so what this gives us overall in this first list for acquisition, supplies, and Firefly, all of which I would describe as kind of classic scenarios, is a kind of classic list, a list that just plays very well to the kind of playstyle that Hector understands very well. He's been playing Infinity for a long time. This is a style that has worked very well across multiple editions, and he has translated it very, very effectively into Infinity N5. For all of N5 efforts to break up this kind of defensive play, nope. Here it is. Here it is present in Kestrel, and that's kind of testament to how broadly Kestrel can play. But this list also just looks really, really solid. It's not hurting at all for firepower. It's got, yeah, kind of two primary guns, but like what primary guns they are, with the fully linked Griffin and the Hetkari. And then it does excellent defense with the Firefly, and excellent specialist play with things like the Banshee and the Scarecrow, and excellent close assault with things like the Beast Hunter and the Yamabushi. This is just a really, really well-rounded list, and there is every chance that this list could equally easily have been played in the final sort of like missions or in Unmasking and Decapitation, but there is incentive in this case to specialize in those missions, because Unmasking and Decapitation, as I mentioned, have a different focus. You need to do pretty specific target elimination in those missions. You really can't win Unmasking without the ability to find and destroy one particular, potentially very dug-in target. And although Decapitation, the HVTs can be often really quite easy to bring down because they're forced to be so far forward, you still do have to reliably be able to take them on. And in that vein, we have what I would call a perhaps more N5, but certainly less conventional Kestrel list that I will just preface with there's a little bit of a fucky-wucky in this one. And that is that this list has miscounted the fire teams that it's able to have. It is unintentionally running a pair of Harry's teams, which Kestrel can't do. Now, it's really common in late N4 and in N5 to see fire teams where you have a three-person core and a Harris team, but you have to really be sure that you can form those teams. And in this particular case, we have a Kestrel Harris and a Colcorp Harris, and neither of those can be cores, and you can only have one Harris. Now, this did actually get caught after the game, and it is the opinion of Hector's opponent that it didn't matter at all. You could very, very easily have run this list with a Colcorp duo, and it's all of the same effect. It's totally fine. However, if you are thinking about playing this list yourself, that is probably something that you might want to account for and just potentially make some changes. There are some fairly easy changes you could feasibly do, or just play it with a single unlinked Jackal. It's not the end of the world. But that is just a caveat. If you pick this list up yourself and decide to play it, because it's a very cool and interesting list, just be careful with how you form your fire teams. You'll have to run two duos and a Haris, because you can't run two Haris teams, and neither of these teams can be cores. So we have a Crux Knight FTO strategic deployment. Now, I am on record as not liking to pay for strategic deployment, and I stand by that, but Unmasking and Decapitation, okay, fair enough, there are certain impetuses forward in this scenario, and in any case, look, the Crux Knight, even if you don't take the strategic deployment extra points, the Crux Knight is just an awesome piece. It fights extremely well. It has Albedo, which is a circumstantial but very useful skill now. Even on ARO, the Crux Knight is a terror because it's effectively firing 3 dice on ARO with high ballistic skill and high durability. It does tons of different things. It can always spend orders, and it is a fantastic point man for a very high order team. It's paired with by Pandra and a Firefly Mine Layer, so we have tactical awareness and a good doctor accompanying this link, which means that the Crux Knight can very easily be recovered. And we have not one, but two Mine Layer marksman turrets in this list, which means that the risk of going second in both unmasking and decapitation, both of them really being quite first turn forward scenarios, is very much mitigated because you have just this out the gate really strong defense. Now you do have a little bit of a deployment constraint in that there's only one source of booty in this list. And so you do kind of need to really maximize them. You need to make sure that both Fireflies deploy within zone of control of your single mulebot, but if you do that, the returns are really, really spectacular. We then have a deployable cover machinist. This is a I had the point spare kind of thing. Yes, theoretically, you could put the Tick-Belang in suppressive fire behind Vitroferous deployable cover and have it be very, very hard to shift. But by Hector's note, that's not something that ever actually came up. It's a bit of a corner case. This is more the points were available and spare. You could trim the machinist back down. In fact, I would go as far as to say you could potentially play without the machinist at all if you really wanted to rejig the list. But it is kind of classic and valuable and pairs very well with a tactical awareness tag. We then have a magistrate, chain of command, not strategos this time. And it in practice should actually be duoed with one of these two jackals. You can do this a variety of different ways. You could deploy them and then see what they roll in terms of their booty, and then move them, have the magistrate deploy with whichever one it makes the most sense to duo with, or just have a redundant jackal, one on ARO maybe, and reform the link if you need, or just have one jackal that is committed to doing things like moving forward or going to suppressive fire, or just doing nothing and being a corner guard. 6 points for a boarding pistol and some other weapons and the potential for booty high roll makes jackals quite worthwhile, even if they're not part of a fire team with a fire team master. And so they filled the list out quite nicely, although it should be worth noted that CanCon was played just early enough to not be in ITS 16 v2. In ITS 16 v2, you would very potentially consider turning one of those jackals into a war correspondent because journalists are specialists in this most recent version of ITS. That would free up a few points, it could change certain things around, you could add, if nothing else, extra palbot, even though you barely need it. Or you could potentially try and find a way to get extra troops in by making some other cuts elsewhere, because this is a 9-4 split list. Not real problem, it's running so many orders, and its defenses are ablative materiel rather than troopers, but you could potentially squeeze an extra troop in here. We then got a Fugazi drone bot, and then we move on to Combat Group 2, which has, this is a terrifying, terrifying duo, the Tick-Belang Lieutenant +1 order and a Firefly. Firefly Mine Layer with armed turret. Now, I'll just finish out the group. We have a Jackal Infiltration Mine Layer. We spoke about how good they are. A Tech Bee. The Tech Bee is the reason why, if you really needed to, you could potentially play without a Machinist. She gives a bonus to the Gizmo Kit Fizz effect for the Tick-Belang, and you can, in a pinch, just have her follow it around and Gizmo Kit it if it goes down, and otherwise just play for it not to go down. A Machinist is very strong and is more traditional, and for good reason. We are, after all, talking about a remote presence tag. You can spend a lot of command tokens rerolling Whip 12 Lieutenant rolls, Whip 12 Engineer rolls, and the Tech B is just a very, very discount addition to that, who also gives the Tick-Belang other benefits. The fact that the Tick-Belang with a Tech B in the list dodges really, really well, I believe actually mattered significantly in the final game, and would probably have mattered over the course of multiple practice games. It's just a very powerful bonus that lets you get the Tick-Belang, it lets you make the Tick-Belang be more safe in situations that it otherwise might not be. We've then got a Mulebot, because you absolutely need a Mulebot in a list that has 2 Mine Layer Fireflies. Now, just to circle back to that Tick-Belang Firefly team, Hector noted in the notes that he sent me, and I'm completely unsurprised by this, that he was initially playing with a Tick-Belang and a Firefly Engineer. And I think that's absolutely the combo that most of us would probably have reached for in the first instance. It adds a specialist to the Tick-Belang without the Tick-Belang having to pop out the Crabot, and hey, it's Engineer and Remote Presence tag synergy. But the Firefly Engineer has a couple of issues in terms of actually practically following the Tick-Belang, which is the Tick-Belang is very, very mobile, and the Firefly is not. And so you're not always in a situation, like it's very easy to keep a model in zone of control of the Tick-Belang. It's not always easy to keep a model able to get to within base contact with the Tick-Belang. On top of that, engineering in active turn on a piece like a Tick-Belang is not something you should actually need to do terribly often. The Tick-Belang is very mobile and very good at winning gunfights, and so shouldn't actually often take that much damage. And what this means is that the higher priority for the Tick-Belang, this is like Tag Tactics 101, is actually that the most important thing to be able to do is to pull the Tickbalang back to a safe and defensive position after it's gone and done all of the things that it needs to do. And while technically the Firefly is adding no special benefit here, right? That Tickbalang is the lieutenant. If it was unlinked, it could just use its orders itself. The better way of thinking about the relationship is that the Tickbalang is actually there to do all of its own stuff, but then benefit the Firefly rather than the other way around, because the Firefly benefits the the list rather as a whole. The Tickbalang is going to be moving forward, it's going to be fighting things, it'll be using its available regular, irregular, and tactical awareness orders for that. And then there will be points during the turn where it just needs to reposition, often reposition defensively. And at that point, you will probably switch to spending, because that'll often be late in the game. Later in the turn, you'll have an idea of what your order budget is like. It is possible that your Group 1 team will need to be spending those Lieutenant orders on their NCO Firefly, but if not, you'll spend one of those Lieutenant orders, maybe two, pulling that Firefly and Tickbalang team back by spending the NCO order, and as part of that, lay down a turret and get the Firefly back in zone of control of the Mulebot. And what that means is that this list has just a really, really effective rhythm to it. It plays like the tides. It pushes these teams forward, it accomplishes mission goals, it pulls back, and it establishes more and more and more defense with those Firefly pieces, which is just a really, really strong playstyle and very, very effective, particularly in terms of things like unmasking and decapitation, where you can often be forced to project force quite far over the table, but you don't want to just leave those pieces there for your opponent to gobble up. So if you have the ability to move out and move back, and as part of that establish a defensive network, and you can do that in this list with multiple marksman turrets and things like drop bears, it's just a really, really strong style. And I think this list, and like these lists in combination, but this unmasking and decapitation list in particular, so far makes the best use of the Firefly mine layer, I think, of any of the Kestrel lists that I have personally seen to date. There has always been a little bit of a tension with the Firefly in that it needs to justify itself on multiple layers, because 24 points just for the first marksman rifle turret mine layer is not quite good enough. If the turret was all that you wanted, you could spend those points on an ARO piece, which, for example, we can see things like the Griffin in combat in the first list. But the potential for those Fireflies, everyone saw it. Like as soon as that model came out, as soon as that profile was released, everyone saw that and was like, that's gonna be completely fucked somehow, right? And this is the first list that's like, yeah, that just sounds egregious. Like, if this list goes first and you have to start your turn playing into four of those marksman turrets on top of everything else, that's just filth. And so there are certain things I would probably change about how this list plays. Among other things, I would probably get a war correspondent in there just to get this up to 15 troopers. And I would also probably personally fix the combat group, the fire team, little fucky wucky. But that this list made it, and that this pairing of lists made it to the top table and performed very well over the course of the event. We'll talk about the final game very briefly after we've covered Ed's stuff. Is unsurprising. This is really strong stuff. And it captures, I think, the essence of Hector as a player, which is we can see on the left hand that old, deep lore and knowledge of someone who has played since N2 almost and knows what they like. And on the right hand, someone who is really good at finding their own line of play and innovating, and Hector is very, very good at both of those things. Now, before we get to how the game actually played out, which I will recount very much in brief, let's have a look at Ed's Toha list. Now, this is Ed from Canberra. He's been featured on this channel many times. I think Hector has as well. I'm sure I've had at least one game against Hector at some point in some event that has been covered in a battle report. But Ed obviously is a more common appearance on the channel, and Ed also made it to top tables playing with Toha. Now, Ed is not historically a Toha player. Ed is a Spiral Core player, but Spiral Core has sung its swan song at the end of N4, which took one of Ed's factions completely out of the game. That's okay, he had multiple factions. Another one was Varuna, which has also been removed completely from the game. And in fact, those were Ed's two main factions. He also played some Hack-Islam, but like a long time ago now. He was very much, by the end of N4, a Spiral Core and Varuna player. And so, if you think, for example, if you were a Pan-Oceania player that feels you were a little hard done by the edition change, I think that's probably not an unreasonable position. But just be aware that there's at least one person out there who had it worse than you, And Ed. Ed is that person. Nevertheless, Ed has a fantastic Ed has just some of the best like attitude takes generally toward the game of anyone I've ever known. Has a fantastic learning heuristic. He's extremely knowledge and developmentally driven, and so he has embraced the alternatives that his models offer him, and one of those is Toha. And so these are Toha lists as written from someone who kind of didn't really play Toha at all because they were a Spiral Core player in N4. And so they're not approached completely from first principles, but they're approached with a slightly different perspective. Like Hector's list, they are also split up by missions, in this case, Firefight and Decapitation on left, and supplies, acquisition, and unmasking on the right. Now, in this case, we can see, we look at Hector's lists, they are split up based on mostly the ability to go after high-value targets and destroy them, right? Force projection. In this case, and this is probably more appropriate for Toha, they are split based on when and how you need to press buttons. In Fireflight and Decapitation, you do not really need to press buttons. You do need to be able to do classifieds in Fireflight, but there is no button pushing in any of them. In supplies, acquisition, and unmasking, you need to be able to deliver specialists to mission objectives just to be able to play the scenario. This is what I would call a very classic kind of breakdown across the two missions, and it's a quite clean kind of way of focusing, particularly if you are approaching this list building paradigm, like if you're new to Infinity, that kind of thing. Mission has buttons, mission does not have buttons is a very clean way of breaking down your lists. So for Firefight and Decapitation, this is, since Decapitation was the final mission at CanCon, this is the list that Ed would play in the finals. We have a full 15 troopers, split 6 and 9. The first smaller combat group is a Greif operator. This is a very classic Ed piece. He really, really likes it. You could feasibly cut and tweak some things and try and find Jan Star, but I've spoken about this many times in the past. The nature of the Greif op compared to Jan Star is that it's way cheaper and therefore way more disposable. You're banking less on its success, and especially in something like Decapitation, if you get first turn, it can often secure you 1 or 2 HVT kills cleanly and easily with relatively few orders. Now, Toha actually generally is pretty good at going after, like every list in Decapitation and Unmasking kind of needs a plan for going after the unmasking targets. Toha has the luxury of not really needing to plan too hard around that because of Ferroware. But in N5, Deadly Ferroware endgame is disposable, which means that you don't necessarily get to just 100% rely on it cleanly. You can have a couple of goes at it, but once those 2 goes are consumed, like once those 2 declarations of ballistic skill attack are consumed, all of the burst you have fired, you can effectively get something like 6 burst, or it'll be a burst 2 plus 1 special die and then a burst 2 plus 1 special die. That's usually enough to take down a HVT. It's not necessarily enough to take down 2, and you can get unlucky. So relying on endgame as the only plan is not necessarily ideal, and we can see something like a Greif op as an adaptation, particularly in Decapitation. In Unmasking, ultimately you can win the game without having to kill every one of those HVTs. Sometimes you need to just kill one. In Decapitation, you really need to kill both. Decapitation is a scenario where both players race to a high score very quickly, and those points on the board for the HVT kills are immediately available and must be seized to proceed with the mission. And so the Greif op makes sense, and it's also very much an Ed piece. We then have an unlinked +1 order tack wheel lieutenant. This is a good piece. He throws smoke, he throws endgame, he will reload off of those Chaxa baggage bots. He's just good for 33 points. Zone of Control smoke grenades with Eclipse are a fantastic tool, and they're probably Toha's. They were one of Toha's best tools in N4, and they even better in N5 because of the relatively lower availability, not lower availability, but the lower strength of Eclipse smoke grenades, because McCalls are now rolling on like 2 dice 13s rather than 2 dice 16s. I think there's some argument these days for just trying to find a way to link that tack wheel and maybe run the +1 command token, which we can see in Ed's second group, just because all of the Ferroware now benefits from Fire Team special die bonuses, and there is a really, really big difference between something like Mirror Ball rolling 2 dice and Mirror Ball rolling 1 dice. Even Endgame benefits hugely from the extra special die. But on the other hand, Lieutenant +1 order gives you 2 whole extra orders that you can spend trying to do the same stuff. We then have 2 Mine Layer Carry Sentinels, very solid 11-point defensive pieces. They make a degree of sense, particularly in things like Fireflight and Decapitation, trying to keep certain elements of your list comfortably intact, and a Liberto Mine Layer and Diplomatic Delegate here as well. So that's 3 Mine Layers in this combat group, multiple pieces of Ferroware, and the Greif Operator, so there's a lot of utility that can come out of this group. The Diplomatic Delegate, under if you were playing this list in a scenario that required button pushing, it would often be a model that gets orders spent on it. In this case, it'll probably have its order converted a bit more often because there is no real need in Firefight or Decapitation to really move the delegate forward. In fact, in Firefight, it's often going to want to stay hidden because it's specialist. But it's a strong defensive piece, and other parts of this combat group can spend those orders very ably. We then have a 9-order combat group 1, and I believe this is broken down as a Haris and 2 duos. That's something that Toha can do now, and it can easily build pure duos, so we're going to see that very often with N5 Toha, and we can see it here. We've got a heavy machine gun K1 Sukwale. It's 33 points and one of the best gunfighters in the game relative to that cost. It's got 2 wounds, it's got Mimetism, it's got Warhorse, it's got a heavy machine gun. The only thing it doesn't want to do is bring down a high armor main battle tag, and that's why we see the Crucial K1 Engineer Combi Rifle. Now, I'm a really, really big fan of the boarding shotgun Crucials, just as cheap link elements that do really good things. But Ed has played, and this comes from his Spiral experience, Ed has played K1 Combi Soquels before, and I am not surprised to see one paired with a HMG here. Now, ultimately, this would match up mechanically kind of poorly into Hector's list because the big threat that Ed needed to overcome in that case was the Tikbalang. And if there's one tag the Corsair doesn't really want to fight, it's the Avatar or the Tikbalang mimetism tags, basically, where it can't kind of get inside range and hope to win the gunfight that way. But as a general piece of capability, this is sound. Again, personally for myself, I would prefer to just play around pieces like that. And so I will lean toward the more cheap, like there's 20 points for a boarding shotgun Corsair. That's a big points difference. 7 points buys you a lot. But just kind of regardless, the Corsair is very, very valuable. It can do things like turn off turrets in zone of control using its deactivator while under eclipse smoke. It's a good specialist. It's a great symbio bomb holder because it's good whip 14. Just generally a very solid piece, although my personal take is that the K1 combi rifle is very much a sometimes food. If you're not sure, just probably take the boarding shotgun as good link filler that does many things. We then have a Kriegel agent. This is a piece I'm not particularly surprised to see and very much like. Breaker combi rifle you will use only if you need to because it's ultimately single wound, but what this lad is linked eraser and linked mirror ball. In a pinch, the grenade launcher also gives you spec fire, which can be very relevant in a scenario like decapitation and unmasking if you don't think you can get, say, endgame to the relevant targets. You can feasibly just spec fire on 6s for 9 orders if you absolutely have to. But the main thing here is the flexibility of mirror ball, particularly mirror ball when it's rolling effectively 2 dice on 13s. Because mirror ball is zone of control, whereas an eclipse grenade is ranged and needs to see the target, you get just unrivaled visibility control with the Kriegel. It is trivially easy to just lay smoke and move forward. There is no need to smoke weave or be careful with your angles. You just place it wherever you need to within 8 inches every time. And because you measure zone of control at the end of each of your short skills, you just always categorically know where you can place the templates. It's hugely flexible, and it also brings Eraser as a sort of defensive / annoying tool. I have had games with Toha where I have done things like just done a run on my opponent's lieutenant with Eraser just to mess up their final turn, for example. So this is a great team. The only thing this team is missing is specifically close combat, because it's fine at short range. It's got a K1 combi rifle and a breaker pistol +1 burst on the Sukwale, which are benefiting from link bonuses, etc. There's no challenge with this fighting even at very, very short range. The only thing it's missing is close combat, and that's something that we will see less of in Toha these days as McCalls become less popular. We then have a pair of duos. The first is primarily defensive. Sukwale Missile Launcher, Kael'ta Chain of Command with a Symbio Bomb and a Symbio Main. Now, we will see the cheaper K1 Sniper in Ed's other list, but if you can afford it, the Missile Launcher presents a more existential high-risk threat. Something like, for example, a Tikbalang knows it is never going to be killed in ARO by the K1 Sniper Rifle, but it could theoretically die to the Missile Launcher. It probably won't. It will probably put the missile launcher down. But everything, at least theoretically, has to respect the threat of the missile launcher. And 1 game in 4, 1 game in 5, that missile launcher will just roll a crit at the worst time for your opponent and potentially win you the game. The Kael'ta Chain of Command, like both of these are pieces that want to just hang out in the rear with the gear. The Sukwale on ARO, the Kael'ta just somewhere where it's a Chain of Command piece, just so that if you want to, you can risk the Tack Wheel Lieutenant a little bit more freely. We then have a more active duo, and this is another interesting one, where we have the Tack Wheel Chain of Command with Viral Combi Rifle. Now, viral weapons are a fair bit weaker in N5 thanks to the bio weapon rule. They can only really hurt. There's just a combi rifle that targets BTS against structure. It's only powerful against models with the Vita attribute. But this is a kind of does everything model, the tack wheel, because it can gunfight with the viral combi rifle, and it has endgame, and it has mirror ball, and it's a specialist. It just really wants a duo bonus, and so it just has a Kael'tar stapled to it, because once the Kael'tar has handed out that Symbiote Bomb and Symbiote Mate, it's done everything that it needs to. This is an example of a good use of the 15-point piece. That's like, well, we'll just go and help the tack wheel. Help the tack wheel. Emotional support. You're an emotional support Kael'tar because the tack wheel really wants to be rolling 2 dice for mirror ball, 3 dice for endgame, 4 dice for the viral combi. It wants to go forward and press buttons and do the mission and all of those very like lay smoke, all of those various different things. Obviously not press buttons, it's a decapitation list, but you get the idea. And then eventually probably pull back to the comfort of its baggage, which we have 2 of those, 2 Chax Auxiliars with baggage. Now, this list does have kind of 4 very static pieces in the form of 2 carries and 2 Chaxes. My personal preference is to thread the needle a little bit more and maybe only run 3 of those pieces if I can and get something else active in there. Because I find that once you commit to like 4 or 5 inactive pieces, you risk tactical inflexibility. Nevertheless, 2 Chaxa Auxiliars in this list are highly valuable. 2 Carry Sentinels are highly valuable. The Chaxa are especially valuable because Endgame is actually more powerful than it's ever been in terms of per use, right? Endgame benefits from fire team bonuses now. It's a technical weapon technically, but what it should be is a ballistic skill whip weapon. It's used using the ballistic skill attack skill. It benefits from fire team bonuses. And so you are now, the per use power of Endgame is higher than it's ever been, but it's disposable. So you have to take baggage because it's so useful to have access to. And so absolutely 1 or 2 Chaxa are really just like lock-ins in any list that has access to endgame, and carry sentinels are very good on their own merits and are also cheap, and orders and mine layers, etc. So I can see why there is a pressure in this list to put all of those pieces in there, particularly again, given this is built for firefight and decapitation, you can afford to maybe have, say, fewer specialists, for example. But for generalist play, it's something that I potentially would maybe personally change. Nevertheless, obviously Ed made it all the way to top table, just like Hector did. And in fact, I believe both players pretty much just major victory their way all the way to the top in this particular case, and that's completely unsurprising. Ed's second list is built for supplies, acquisition, and unmasking, and so, although actually there are a fair few similarities, we have a little bit of a change here, and what we can see actually is that Ed's list has built with a little bit of an intention to Tohar are not good at getting hacking bonuses in missions, but they're not bad at all at getting paramedic and doctor bonuses, and we can see that present here. And so this list we have, in fact, multiple models that are particularly good in, for example, supplies because of that doctor bonus. We also have engineers, which are good in acquisition, which leaves just unmasking, where you kind of have to brute force your way through the objectives to press buttons to go after targets. So in this case, we have a fairly similar combat group 2. In this case, there is an active weapon in that group. We have a duo of a Sukhwheel K1 sniper rifle and a Kael'tar chain of command light shotgun. This is doing all of the same things that the missile launcher Kael'tar team is in the first list. It's just that sometimes you need the points, and 29 points is considerably less than 34 points. In fact, it's 5 points less. And so if you need to save 5 points, you can just move to the K1 sniper rifle, and sometimes spend orders on it inactive if it's something that's useful to do. You've got more forgiving range bands on the K1 sniper rifle, but the main merit is just that it's cheaper. In this case, it's paired with the Kael'tar, which means that this team could, if it needed to, move forward because the Kael'tar is a specialist. We then have the first of 3 baggage Chaxes in this list, a diplomatic delegate and a Liberto. Now, in this list, in this combat group, for all of these scenarios, I would expect the diplomatic delegate to be pushed forward more. It would be challenging for her to reach a button, for example, on the first turn and really like capitalize on that, but she can move forward, she can project that eraser and put herself in a situation where as a turn 2 specialist, for example, it might be quite easy to make her work. Libertos can kind of do similar things, but I expect to see particularly the diplomatic delegate in all 3 of these missions have considerably more orders spent on her than the diplomatic delegate in the first list. We then have a 10-person combat group 2, and this will be 2 Haris teams and 2 duos. Tohar are limited to 2 duos but can have unlimited Haris teams, so we have sort of like proper fire team composition here where 2 duos, 2 Haris teams in this list. Lots of linked troopers. The first of these 2 Haris teams is, again, Sukhwheel HMG, unsurprising, excellent troop, Takwheel Chain of Command, and a Kamale Paramedic. Now, if you just swap that Kamel Paramedic, you have an N4 Tohar link, like a classic N4 Tohar link. And a McCall in that team would give you close combat, but you have, if you need to fight inside very close range bands, you can always use the pistol, sorry, on the Sukwale, just with the caveat that you can't reach close combat. Now, the absence of the McCall in N4 would have meant that you were relying on Mirror Ball to lay smoke, but in N5, relying on Mirror Ball to lay smoke is no problem, because effectively 2 dice on 14s in zone of control is a piece of piss. Like, you just it's easy. You just get that smoke down with the tack wheel. There is no need for the smoke grenades like there was in N4. So instead, rather than a McCall, we lose that close combat ability, but we gain a Kamel Paramedic, who is 1, a paramedic, and 2, a specialist highly suitable to supplies. If you play this list in supplies and rather than a Kamel you have a McCall, then you're using that tack wheel to try and roll 14s with no particular bonuses, which is very doable, but it can be prone to a failure chain, whereas the Kamel is just almost always going to succeed on the first or at least second try. The next fire team we have is a probably defensive fire team. And here we can see, once again, some of Ed's spiral core roots coming through, the presence of a Tagma multispectral visor. Now, I have no idea what this thing was holomasking as, but it was almost certainly holomasking as something. But it will be linked with a Kumatail, who's an engineer and a doctor, and a Kael'tar. Now, this is ultimately kind of a fragile team. This is all just single wound stuff. But the Tagma is shock immune, and the Kumatail is a doctor, and you have just enough triad troops in this list to be benefiting from +1 special die, if not the other bonuses for a 3-person team. Now, I'm not sure how well overall this team would have performed. I would assume probably adequately much of the time, with the kind of note that the Tagma is not necessarily going to reach the high watermark that other MSV2 shooters might reach in other lists for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's gated behind Viral. Viral is unfortunately just kind of okay in N5 for the reasons that I mentioned. It's not good against anything with structure. But then secondly, there is no smoke in this list that you can shoot through with the Tagma. There is very limited access to regular smoke grenades. I think it's just on the Preceptors, who really are not very good at throwing it with very low fizz. And so while smoke shooting is technically in reach, in practice it's kind of out of reach of Tohar. And what that means is that the Tagma is doing the Tagma needs to trade on a couple of things to be fully effective. Firstly is just it's got counterintelligence. That's good. Counterintelligence is a good skill that's worth getting in your lists if the impost is not high. And because this Tagma is doing other things, it's not like we're just paying 16 points for a generic Tagma just for access to counterintelligence. Secondly, this is kind of an ambush piece. The viral sniper Tagma can pretend to be something else. It does have hollow mask. It could pretend to be something with short range, for example, and lure your opponent into thinking that perhaps there are not firepower pieces in a position where in fact there are firepower pieces. That's something that you can't rely on consistently, because some people will make the call like, oh, there's a 1.5 SWC missing, and you have a Kumatail linked with that something over there. So the utility of Hollow Mask as a truly deceptive play begins to thin out the further through an event and the more experienced opponents you play goes, but it is still something that it can do. But finally, look, this is overall not a particularly expensive team, and the Kumatail has specialist bonuses in acquisition and supplies, and that's just valuable to have, and having a doctor is just kind of valuable to have, and having a doctor even has some utility in unmasking. I believe you can't use paramedics, but you can use doctors. This is an N4 truth, but I think it's still the case in N5. You can doctor downed HVTs, you cannot paramedic them, so there is some utility there. Again, not necessarily something that I would play, but Ed is a Spiral Core player transitioning to N5, and this is really a Spiral Core team. We then have the second duo, which is the Coastal Engineer K1 Combi Rifle and the Tactical Lieutenant +1 Command Token Viral Combi Rifle. This is a link that I wouldn't be surprised if it breaks from time to time, but hey, it's our second tack wheel. Tack wheels are still good for all of the reasons that I mentioned. Linking tack wheels is still good for all of the reasons that I mentioned. And the Coastal Engineer, in this case at least, there is some logic to pairing a Viral Combi Rifle and a K1 Combi Rifle. The Viral Combi Rifle is good against certain things, the K1 Combi Rifle is good against certain things, as much as I might personally just prefer the cheap Coastal Engineer, the 20-point version, because it's 20 points. These two cover each other kind of nicely if you can just get into rifle range bands and force those fights through. Finally, we've got two Chaxa Baggage Auxiliars, so this is the second and the third Chaxa Auxiliar, because there's two tackle wheels in this list, and you've got to be able to reload them for them to be fully effective. Now, If I'm being blunt, I would say the degree of specialization in these lists is relatively limited. And specifically what I mean by that is that if you put a gun to Ed's head and said, Ed, play your firefight and decapitation list in supplies, acquisition, or unmasking, he 100% could. Like, Ed is a good enough player, and he has built enough tools that, like, yeah, there's not a lot of specialists, but that there's a diplomatic delegate in the first list, there's a diplo delegate, and a whip 14 specialist, and a whip 14 specialist, and a whip 14 specialist. The first list is by no means hurting at all for serviceable elements to do even button pressing intensive missions. And that means, kind of by definition, that both lists are relatively well-rounded, because all of those VIP 14 specialists are still good troops for other reasons, which means that when we look at Ed's second list, the Whip 14 specialists are all still present, and they're all still doing the other good things that they could do. There's still the Sukwil in there, there's still the tack wheels, etc. And to me, this means two things. The first is that Ed has thought more about this than I have, and that's a truth. Okay, Ed has put a lot of thought into each of these lists, and so there are degrees of specialization that I know I will be missing. There are little edge cases and plays that he has found useful and worthwhile in, for example, the presence of the Kamale and the Kamale and the Kumatail that are, like, very relevant, for example, that I will be glossing over because I am willing to try and beat my opponent and brute force the scenario. The other thing that it tells me is that this is just one way to build a Toha pairing. I am fairly confident that because of the presence of pieces like Coast are just good now. Tack wheels are as good as they've ever been. You can just fit multiple Whip 14 specialists into a list as part of a generic game plan. It means that there are other ways to build Toha if you want to, right? You could build a Toha pairing by mission, like Ed has, or you could build a Toha pairing for tables or for opponents. And while I suspect that there would be that same commonality between the two lists, the existence of multiple subtle inflections is still quite promising. Ultimately, I think probably the biggest difference between these two lists, frankly, is the presence of the Greif operator in the first list. The Greif operator in Decapitation and Firefight just offers certain significant, like, high potential abilities, and makes an awful lot of sense in that context, where it makes less sense it's not playing to the same strengths in supplies and acquisition, and especially not in unmasking. Even though theoretically in unmasking you have to do the same thing as in decapitation, you really don't, because if you put that Greif operator down, your opponent is often going to split 3 HVTs, and you have to jump through hoops before even the first one can be revealed. You are not guaranteeing nearly the same amount of points. There is not the same payoff for putting a Greif operator down near 1 HVT. Now, in terms of the actual game between these two titans, it can ultimately be summarized kind of relatively simply. Decapitation was the final mission, and the lieutenant role matters an awful lot in that particular case. Whip 13 on the Tick Belang versus Whip 14 on the Tack Wheel, and the Tick Belang won. And as we mentioned, that decapitation list of Hector's plays like the tides, and it played very, very much to that game plan, which was very, very strong. He moved forward, he killed both of Ed's decapitation targets. It can be very difficult to hide your HVTs in decap because they are forced to be so far forward by the 16-inch deployment zones, and then Hector just civ-evac'd his own HVTs and walked them to the back of his deployment zone, threw up a bunch of turrets, and that was kind of the game. That is the very, very short version. The game itself was very long. The TOs actually allowed them extra time to play because everyone else was just at the con and mingling. And I don't know how long exactly the game took to play, but it was a marathon by all accounts. I remember, like, texting the TO and being like, "Oh, hey, what are the results?" And I'm like, "What do you mean it's still turn 2? When is this finishing?" But they did play to conclusion, and off the strength of winning first turn and having just a really, really powerful turn 1 plan, Hector was able to carry the game. Toha in general and Ed's list in specific, I think, absolutely can deal with things like turret spam, but they need to deal with things like turret spam in a very mission-focused kind of way. And because in this particular case, Hector had scored 4 points on the first turn, and then taken those 4 points that Ed might score and put them in the back of his deployment zone behind an absolute wall of turrets, meant that any kind of assault that Ed would make, because then this Ed's list could do that, right? Ed's list did feasibly have the ability to move forward, lay smoke, destroy the turrets, continue moving, destroy the HVTs, but the cost of doing that would be all of the orders Ed might feasibly have access to, and delivering a large number of points to Hector's deployment zone just to make that run on the HVTs. And in Decapitation, there are also points for army kills, and it would be trivial for Hector to collapse in on and destroy those assault teams if they try and make that run all the way through, and then re-establish the turret defense, etc. And so ultimately, while both players are very, very skilled, and while both players majored their way all the way to the final round and are very, very worthy of the top table in Canberra, this ultimately was Hector's year, with Hector going undefeated on 5 majors and Ed going on 4 majors and 1 loss. I definitely think both players are fairly close to evenly matched, and with different dice or on a different table, it could easily have swung another way. But once Hector won the LT role and had such a clean ability to put such a practiced game plan into play, the return line for Ed potentially didn't exist. If it did exist, I would have expected Ed to be able to find it. He's very, very, very good at that, but it's just very uphill from about that first turn. Nevertheless, big congratulations to both of them, obviously, for making to top table, much the same as big congratulations to Brennan and Owen for making it to top table of Colder Than Carbonite. That concludes the top table list assessment for both of these events. As a reminder, if you're looking for more content about any of these, it's very likely that the Tactical Awareness podcast will be doing an event report where you can find out more. And I also wouldn't be surprised if Loss of Lieutenant either has already or will in future either interview Hector or cover in some capacity the events at CanCon. So both of those as good alternate sources for content about these 4 different players, and in this case, 6 different lists, 8 different lists overall. Hope very much that you've enjoyed this in terms of future content. I have an extremely long list of channel supporter requests that I am hoping to get to over time. Ultimately, if the list keeps growing, I have more and more things to choose from, but just as a reminder, if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below, or by becoming a channel member on YouTube. I take requests for topics and faction focuses and battle report factions from channel supporters of all types. But if you've made a request, just be aware that I do have a long list of things that I'm working through. It may take a little bit of time before stuff that you requested will get seen to, but I absolutely have made a list and I'm checking it twice. As another note, in terms of future content, my computer is on the way out in a pretty big way. It is kind of refusing to boot up with anything resembling regularity, and so if there is a content break or some lapses in content over the next few weeks, it's because it's finally died. I'm looking at getting a replacement, matters are already in motion, but that sort of stuff all takes time, and of course I will have to reset up all of the recording setup and everything on the new device, which will not be fun and will take time. Hopefully, no drops in content, but that's not something that's going to be reliable. So, if I'm not able to get a video out at some point over the next couple of weeks, well, I will tell everyone why, but that'll probably be why. That said, I hope very much that you've enjoyed this video. I'm hoping for the next video to be a battle report, potentially featuring Hassassin Baram, but we will see, and regardless, I will see you next time.